Hello everybody, welcome to my Exam 3 Essay 2 video. Usually I try to do this in a classroom and teach, but I'm a little under the weather, so we're going to do it with this whiteboard in my house. Let's get started. So first we're going to talk about pressure volume loops. So if we have a graph here, our x-axis, that's going to be our volume. So we're going to look at this as if this was the left ventricle. So this is going to be our volume, our x-axis, and our y-axis is going to be our pressure. So I have it here, millimeters of Hg, okay? So we're going to start at this point here. Now at this point, this is where our mitral valve is open. So right here, let's see if I can do this upside down, MV open. Okay, so our mitral valve is open here, and what we have going on is this line. That's called ventricular filling. So that's when we have that kind of passive blood flow from the left atria into our left ventricle. Now at this point where it kind of stops, this is where our mitral valve is going to close. So that's when eventually the pressure, it gets high enough that it's higher in the left ventricle than the left atrium. So our MV valve closes. This point is also called preload. Now what preload is kind of the amount of stretch that your heart has in its sarcomeres. That's kind of how much it can expand and the max it can expand before it pushes and sends blood flow. Okay, so that's essentially what preload is, just the amount of stretch, or the max capacity of blood that your ventricle can have is a good way to think of it too. Okay. So that happens, and then our pressures are going to kind of go up here. Now right at this point, this is where our pressures are going to be higher in the ventricle than they are in the aorta. So this is where our semilunar is going to open. So it's going to open there. Now this line here, this is what's called isovolumetric contraction. So that's when that ventricle is starting to contract, starting to build up pressure. Eventually it blows that valve open, and then blood just rushes through the aorta into the rest of the body. So now this line here, this is going to be ejection, the ejection phase. So blood rushing from the ventricle into the aorta. That's our ejection phase. Right here at this point, this is going to be where our aortic valve closes. Okay, and then our pressure is going to drop again. So right here, this line, that's going to be isovolumetric relaxation. And they're just kind of repeat the cycle. So main things you got to remember is where your valves open, what's going on at these lines. So we have ventricular filling, isovolumetric contraction, ejection, isovolumetric relaxation. Okay, and then our MV valve is going to open here. Going to come through, it's going to close there, go up, or SL, aortic valve is going to open, and it's going to close right here, okay? So from about this point around to this point, that's diastole, so that's when the ventricle is relaxing. Then from this point around to this point, that is systole, so that's when the ventricle is contracting there, okay? So let me pause the video, I'm going to erase my whiteboard, and we'll move on to baroreceptor reflexes really fast. Okay, so now we're going to go through baroreceptor reflex. So what your baroreceptors are is they're located in your aorta, and then kind of these three branches of your aorta. There's going to be kind of a little ball of them up in there. And so what it does is a stretch detector. It's going to detect some stretch in the aorta and in those arteries, and then so it's going to detect some stretch, which is going to mean that our pressure is going to be too high here, and it's stretching that aorta. So what it's going to do is via some afferent neurons, it's going to come and it's going to synapse here in the brainstem. Okay, so it's going to synapse in the brainstem via some afferent neurons, and then in the brainstem we're going to have, it's going to kind of synapse with our SNS and also our PNS. Okay, It's going to synapse with our autonomic nervous system, and it's going to tell the heart that it needs to slow down because its pressure is too high. So it's going to decrease peripheral resistance, it's going to decrease heart rate, which is going to decrease the blood pressure. But it's also going to be detecting if there's not enough stretch, because we still need some stretch in there. So if there's not enough stretch, then what we're going to do is we're going to send afferent neurons here, and again it's going to say, hey, there's not enough stretch. So now it's going to increase your heart rate and increase your peripheral resistance to get that pressure up. Essentially, baroreceptors, they're just stretch detectors, and they detect how things change there and how we can get the stretch up or down in our aorta and in those arteries. Okay, so that's it for baroreceptor reflex. Super easy. We're going to move on. It looks like I forgot something with the cardiac cycle, so we're going to go back there really quick, and we'll go from there. Okay, so one thing I forgot was cardiac cycle. Did you notice there's this dotted line right here? So this is going to be where like our AV valve closes. So what this line tells us, or what the slope kind of tells us, it's just telling us how much change in pressure we can detect with, or we can do with a certain amount of change in volume, okay? Which is also called inotropy. So inotropy. Oh, that's not how you spell it. Tropy. Okay, which is also kind of the force of contraction. That's kind of curved down, but so inotropy is the force of contraction. So, and again, it's going to be our change in pressure per change in volume, like that. Okay, so if this line, say it was steeper of a slope, that means you have higher inotropy, which means you have higher force of contraction. But say it wasn't as steep, you have lower entropy or lower force of contraction. Okay, so that's it for that. We're going to move on to capillaries, and then that'll be it for this video. Sorry, one more thing that I think they want us to cover. So we know cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So what our stroke volume is it's going to be our end diastolic volume, or sorry, our end diastolic volume right here, minus our end systolic volume right here. Okay, that's how we find stroke volume. So say our preload, if it increased, then we're going to have higher stroke volume. But if it decreased, we're going to have lower stroke volume. Okay, so that's about it for that one. And now we can get to capillaries. Okay, so before we get into capillaries, we have to talk about mean arterial pressure, okay, or MAP. So if we break it down, kind of our, excuse me, how our blood vessels are kind of broken down. Now our aorta is going to be our biggest vessel. Close to that is going to be our arteries. Further away, arterioles. And then we're going to have capillaries, venules, veins, and then like the right heart, okay? Now our pressure is going to be highest in the aorta. So it's going to be kind of bouncing there. And it's going to steadily drop through the sections. Eventually our capillaries, they're kind of right around 30 is what our pressure is when those open. It's going to close around 10. And then in the veins, the pressure is like 10 to 0. Okay, so our pressures are very low. But kind of if we drew a line down the middle of this, that would be our MAP, or our map. Okay, so I think that's all we had to talk about for that. Let me make sure here. Regulate map. Okay, so things that can kind of influence map. So our map can be cardio output times peripheral resistance. So if we want to increase our map, we can increase cardio output or peripheral resistance, or both. It's also diastolic pressure plus 1/2 of systolic pressure plus, where's it time? Yeah, plus diastolic pressure. So also on our blood pressure, if we want to, we can kind of increase our systolic pressure and our diastolic pressure, and that's going to increase our mean arterial pressure, okay? So let's move on to capillaries really fast. And I guess kind of some variables here are peripheral resistance. Its formula is going to be PR equals 8 times viscosity times length divided by pi radius to the 4th. Okay? So that's what our PR is going to be. So if we want to increase our PR, like we mentioned there, which is going to increase our MAP, we can increase the viscosity of our blood. So if it's very viscous, then your PR is going to go up. The length of your arteries, if we increase that, it's going to go up. Or we can decrease the radius of our arteries, and that's also going to decrease it a little bit. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so we're going to look at our capillaries and kind of different variables, or kind of how fluid is moved in and out of the capillaries. Okay, so on this side, this is going to be kind of our arterial side, artery side. This is going to be our vein side. Okay, so right here, you're going to kind of have what's called a sphincter, or a precapillary sphincter. What that does, it kind of resists change to, or resist MAP, so it can resist up to 160 MAP. But anyway, and so what that does is it creates kind of some pressure in the capillaries, and that's called HP. Okay, now HP, it's going to be pushing kind of against the walls of the capillaries. Okay, so with that, and it's usually on the arterial side, it's about 30 millimeters of mercury. Vein side's about 10. But where it's pushing kind of against it, it's going to want fluid to move out. Okay. Now what we also have is you have blood, colloid, the O I can't remember, but it's like proteins in here. So what colloid means is essentially too big to dissolve, but it's also too small that gravity affects it. So it's just kind of suspended in here. And what that does is with these proteins, it kind of creates a bit of a gradient. So our gradient is there's higher proteins inside than there are out. So what that's going to do is it's going to want to move fluid into the cell. Okay. Then we also are going to have some proteins kind of out here, outside the capillaries. This is going to have our ISOP, our interstitial colloid osmotic pressure. This is blood colloid osmotic pressure. This is interstitial blood colloid pressure. HP, can't remember what it was called. I think it's just like heart pressure or something like that. But anyway, so if we look at the gradient here, there's more outside than our inside, so it's going to want to move fluid to the inside. Okay, or no, sorry, excuse me, to the outside. So I want to move fluid out. Okay, and then the last thing is on our capillaries, we're going to have some lymphatic vessels. And these lymphatic vessels, they have a pressure of about -3 millimeters of mercury, so it creates kind of a vacuum. What that does is it kind of slurps up any like excess fluid. So that's obviously going to have fluid kind of coming out because it's kind of sucking that fluid out, okay? And if we take the nets, we have like -3 here, but usually if you're doing your math, just put 3. So you have about 30 here, 3 here. Your blood colloid is about 28 in, and then your ISOP is about 8 out. Okay, so you have 30 out, 28 in, and then, gosh dang, what was that? 8 out, and then 3 out. So kind of our net effect of everything is going to be about 13 out on the arterial side and about 7 in on the vein side. So essentially how it affects it, we're going to have 13 kind of coming out. And on the vein side, it's going to be having about 7 millimeters of pressure coming in. Remember, that's just because that HP drops there, okay? So what would happen is if we changed these, it could cause kind of some fluid, like some excess fluid, and that's called edema. So if we have like pulmonary edema, that's when like with congestive heart failure, having lots of fluid kind of on the outside of your lungs. You have lots of fluid buildup in your gut, lots of fluid buildup in your feet, etc., etc. So one thing, what if we were to say you didn't eat enough protein? You weren't eating any protein, so you don't have any blood colloid osmotic pressure. Okay, what's that going to do? That was a pressure in, so it's bringing stuff in, but now you don't have that. So now this in pressure, it's not going to cancel out any out pressure. So now you're going to have a lot more fluid coming out. It's going to be excess. Our lymphatic vessels, they're working to try to suck up any excess fluid, but it's not going to be able to outrun it. So you have fluid buildup here. Your feet are going to swell, and your gut's going to swell. It's not going to be a fun time. So that's one example of edema and how these osmotic pressures kind of affect each other in the capillaries to build up excess fluid. That's the end of this video. Thank you.